So hey, this is Stu and I'm here for Love Yoga Anatomy, and today I'm here with Doug Keller, which is fantastic because I've been reading his stuff and reading his things on Yoga Journal for seems like years and years. How can you tell us a bit about yourself first and how long you've been in the world of Yoga Anatomy?
Well, I got interested in yoga as yoga first in the sense of meditation,
Mm-hmm.
and from that got interested in asana years later, and then from the interest in asana, started to study the anatomy to understand the asana better. So I'm kind of coming from the different direction of starting with the spiritual and working into the physical.
Inwards. And did you have any background in anatomy at all before that point?
Honestly, not technically. That's all been self-study with people who do work like Tom Myers and Eric Dalton and other people like that. And the yoga gives a good focus for learning the anatomy because it's in the context of trying to understand what's going on in the posture that you can learn and kind of absorb the significance of the anatomy better rather than just taking a book and opening it and trying to learn it.
And what was it you wanted to know in those early days? Why were you suddenly interested in the anatomy? Was it?
In the beginning, it was because, when we teach asana and alignment, you're given certain directions or principles for practice, and it's often treated as basically the same action or the same principle for everybody across the board. And you recognize that the same instruction doesn't work the same way for each person, and sometimes there are significant differences between people. What works for one is not so great for another. So I understood I had to at least be able to observe and understand what's appropriate for the people, and so what emphasis I can give, and that meant understanding how these instructions and principles balanced each other's, so you can give more emphasis to one side or to the other.
So you're very much from that point of view, because there's like two fields of sort of view, quite counterposed, isn't there? One from the idea, well, you just do it and your body will sort of figure out what you need to do. And basically everybody does roughly the same thing, which makes it quite difficult for sort of or simple for lead classes, big classes.
Yeah.
And then you've got the idea of, no, actually, look, bloody hell, we're all completely different. How can we do exactly the same thing?
Yeah, and to me, the essence of the yoga has always been much more about the person cultivating self-awareness on every level, not just on the level of meditation, but even inhabiting the body and being in it. In the beginning, I was primarily interested in meditation, wasn't really quite sure what stretching your hamstrings really had to do with that, apart from being able to sit comfortably. But then I came to appreciate more just the feeling of presence and flow, and being able to be with the meditation was taking place in the body as much as the mind, and the body was part of the experience. And so even the asana practice is part of that process of becoming more self-aware and inhabiting the body as part of your spiritual experience. And so I think the yoga, in the beginning, like you're saying, it's easier if people are given simple instructions so that they can follow and start to feel the practice and understand the practice. And then as people get more experience, then they start to become more aware of what really works for them and what doesn't quite feel right, but they do it because they're supposed to. And at some point it starts to cut off the process of self-inquiry if they're just always following the same instructions. So the way of teaching is not so much telling the person what they need to do in their body, but actually instigating or encouraging this inquiry where they feel what's right for them. And you give them possibilities to try out and say, you can try this out, see if it works for you, if that gives you a better sense of freedom. If that doesn't work, try this. And then they have the freedom to decide for themselves what's really working and the asana and taking them forward. So you're sort of facilitating self-inquiry after you get past the point of simply instructing.
Once you've got them in the door. That's amazing.
Exactly.
And of course, a lot of people are turning to yoga now because they have that sense in themselves that it's going to be good for them.
Yeah.
Not quite sure why that might be necessarily. And so they're arriving and their expectations vary from, oh Christ, take me out of this pain, to, oh yes, I just want to feel more in touch with my body, or I want to be more aware of what's going on.
Yeah. Well, sometimes they're given the impression that yoga is this magic pill, that if you just come in and do it, it'll work. And sometimes it's even said, if you just show up for the practice and do it and do it and do it, it will heal you in and of itself, which doesn't involve the element of participation.
Yeah.
And like you're saying, the people that come in and say, I want to feel my body, I want to understand better, they're ready for participating in the practice. Whereas other people that would say, I'm in pain, get me out of pain, give me something, give me a pose,
Yeah.
it'll take away my back pain. You can help them in the beginning, but if they don't participate in that, just like in every other kind of therapy, if the person doesn't participate,
Yeah.
the process is that much less effective.
And what you've been doing here, so I've caught up with you in London, and you're at the Life Centre in London, and you're teaching, is it yoga therapy?
I'm calling it the therapeutic wisdom of yoga,
Okay.
partly because yoga therapy is becoming more and more of a tricky term
Yes.
in terms of what it promises. And I'm also recognizing that yoga as a practice is much broader than therapy in the sense of helping you with specific physical problems or even breath problems. And contained within yoga, there's a lot of wisdom that can be had that will help you with therapeutic problems, but yoga is not limited to therapy. And yoga doesn't encompass necessarily the whole of therapy.
Yeah.
And so we're looking for the wisdom to be had in the practice. And that becomes part of your regular practice, but it's also there when you need it at the times when pain comes up or different problems.
And this is aimed at teachers rather than individuals
This
that are
training
not
is aimed
qualified.
at teachers, and it's both ideas that teachers can take into class and use in class in a way that helps people explore the practice and have a better experience of it without necessarily giving a long detailed lecture about anatomy or therapy.
Yeah.
But at the same time, when they have students with questions, why does my knee hurt, what's wrong with my shoulder, for the teacher to have some tools to look at the student and understand what's going on and give a few extra tools for the person to work with. So,
Are there problems involved for teachers when students come to them, and it happens all the time? I know I still get emails all the time saying, look, my hip hurts, my knee hurts, my neck hurts, what you can do about it? So how do we find, are we qualified, as yoga teachers, to even address any particular issue?
I'm focusing upon, and this is where I've learned a lot from a lot of the movement therapists and body workers, because what they're often looking for or expecting is some kind of diagnosis. It's already been clear that we're not trained to make a diagnosis. We don't have the equipment or the training, and a diagnosis often looks for damage to the body or some kind of tissue damage that's the root of pain. And I'm focusing on the aspect of how it's the patterns in which we move, not only how we hold ourselves in posture, but also how we move into actions like bending forward or twisting.
Right.
And the habits that we develop are often at the root of the chronic pain that we experience that's not necessarily coming from tissue damage per se, like a herniated disc or a torn ligament, but it's often it's within the connective tissue of the body as a kind of distortion that came up from bad patterns of movement. If you change the pattern of movement, and the asana is an opportunity to find or learn different ways of moving that kind of take you out of those habits, if that reduces the pain, then you've addressed the pain without making a diagnosis or acting as if you're a doctor. When somebody says, what's wrong with my shoulder? They're asking you to look in there and tell them if they have a torn rotator cuff. Obviously, we can't see that. But if we change the way they move and the pain becomes less, then you can say, now we're onto something. And you've still maintained the proper boundaries between what you can do and a massage therapist and a doctor can do.
Yeah, and there's still a lot of their own involvement in that too, isn't it?
Yeah, because that demands more of their participation and awareness of when the pain comes up, how the pain comes up, what tends to promote the pain, and also what kinds of action reduce the pain. It's for them to tell you how it's working. And this is also a switch that they're not often used to, because sometimes a doctor doesn't listen to how a patient reports the pain. The doctor says, this is what is wrong with you, and the patient says, well, I hurt when I do this. The doctor says, no, this is your problem. And we're turning things around to where we're really listening to the person and dialoguing with the person so they grow themselves out of that situation by their own self-awareness. And we're just facilitating the process. And obviously that involves a lot less, shall we say, promises that you can be held liable for in the future, or actions where you're kind of overstepping your boundaries and doing something you're not qualified to do. And there's a vast field for us to explore in that doesn't overstep the boundaries of medical science and is often quite a good complement to medical science.
So maybe you're saying, maybe look, you're moving in this particular way, if you moved in this way, you might find it was better, or it might find it wasn't better.
Yeah.
See how it goes.
Yeah, it's particularly how we go into forward bend or back bend, or how we move our shoulder. It's often spoken of, Shirley Sarman calls it a movement impairment syndrome. It means a certain part of the body is either not moving enough, or is in some cases moving too much, and then that causes that kind of discombobulation in the movement that can cause pain in the muscle or even the fascia. And so, for instance, if the shoulder blade doesn't move properly when you lift your arm, then you start to experience pinching or pain in your shoulder until you get the shoulder blade to mobilize properly, and then all the bones and muscles work together and there's not that pain or constriction.
Because this sort of detail, what sort of numbers do you need to work with in a class? Because
I'm finding you can work effectively with a normal size class.
Right.
Anywhere from 10 to 30 students. And I mean, the bigger the class becomes, the more it becomes a little bit more like cheerleading and less like teaching.
Yes.
You know, because there is a limit to how much detail you can give. But you, as much as I understand the details behind what I'm saying, you can always boil it down to simple points of action that achieve the same purpose, not necessarily explaining it to the student, but if the student says that works for me and that feels better, then you made progress and they can start to explore that. And if they want the explanation, you can give the explanation. But it's better for a regular class for them to have the experience first and the explanation second.
Yeah.
Otherwise you get so intellectual you never get around to the experience.
You're actually doing it.
And also give the people the freedom to realize that not everything you say is necessarily going to work for that person, because often they have that idea, well, I have to do it the way he says it because that's the way it's done. No, this may be helpful to you. If it doesn't work, we've got something else we can try, because it's learning how to move your body in the best way.
And is there key areas that are showing up in our present time that you think are the root of many things going on in the body?
Most often the complaint is around the neck and the shoulders. There's certainly low back and hip and knee stuff, but there's always something going on with people's shoulders. I think it is related to how we position and use our neck, because if the head and the neck are out of alignment, then the shoulders get stressed. And so I'm more often starting with the upper body first, and that becomes practical things that people can both incorporate into the yoga practice, but also be an awareness that they bring during the day. And that often resolves a lot of the problems going on in the lower body. And if they have stuff going on with the hips and the lower back, we can address that too. And certainly the two are related, but I think more often it's stuff around the neck and the shoulders, and then that becomes a back problem.
And that's sort of brought about maybe by a very much head forward posture nowadays in so many people. I even notice it in myself when I look at the videos, you know, watching it back, and go, bloody hell, he's got his head forward, get it back, for God's sake.
I was saying during the training today, I spend the whole day walking around the class looking at people as they're doing stuff, and it's almost inevitable by the end of the day your head's forward here, so you just have to learn how to bring it back and bring yourself together again.
And I sat in obviously on some of your class this afternoon, which was fantastic. It was really a great experience to watch you at work. And you were talking about the complexities even of that action of just taking your head back. It's not as simple as just
the ways in which people correct often make the problem worse. And we're aware of the head being forward, so as I was saying, often people try to correct it by trying to pull the chin in, and that's often the instruction people have heard in the last, pull your chin in, tuck your chin in, and that tends to create more complications for the neck. So it's really feeling how the head floats upon the spine and slides upon the spine, instead of the head being something you just like push back into the right place, because it doesn't work that way. And so it's getting all of the parts to align with each other, because our body and our posture is very dynamic. It's not like a building that just stands in one way. Once you built it, all of the parts are moving relative to each other, because we're built for movement, even more than we are for sitting still.
And are there certain things that because you're traveling all around the world, so you're going to see sort of good variety, cross-section of people. Are there sort of things that you see cropping up in classes on a regular sort of thing that you think, well, you know, that habit or that instruction that we've now has been ingrained is not so cool, really?
Well, the funny thing is, you see, I always joke that beginners in yoga have beginners' injuries that are generally not that bad, and then you learn actions that can benefit the beginner, and then we start to overdo or become too good at those actions. So arching the back in the beginning to do a better forward bend with less restriction in the hamstrings is helpful. If you start to overdo it after years, you start to create new problems, and so you have to back off. And so it's always a matter of balancing actions and energy so you feel that you're moving from the most centered place. And the problem is we always tend to overcorrect a little bit. And so the later things we learn are addressing how we overcorrected in the past, which means it's, for each individual, it's an evolutionary process. And I think you even see how yoga instructions have evolved as this process of self-correction has gone on. I mean, even seasoned, long-time experiences like teachers like Mr. Iyengar, you can see his instructions change over time. And even he, in his biography, he said, when I looked at the first Light on Yoga book, I could see where my injuries came from. And some of the pictures, he went back and reshot the pictures. He was doing the poses better in his 50s and 60s than he was in his 40s because he's learned something. And he would share that with the students. But again, when you've got a large movement or a worldwide movement of students, not just with the Iyengars, but with Ashtanga and everything else like that, you give an instruction, that's kind of taken as gospel globally, and then it's a little bit hard to move out of that and correct for the ways in which we've overdone those things. So it is a kind of glacial movement of learning and reforming, and as much as we can stimulate that process.
And of course we have students coming from people that have done no exercise at all to people that might have done gymnastics or track and field or cheerleading or something. So the whole abilities of their body are right at a different level right from the word go.
And how they approach it is different, and each person brings their habit to it too, because even people in sports, the muscles they develop to excel in sports are not necessarily the muscles they're meant to be accessing when they do a yoga practice, and that can be problematic for them until they learn how to do it. And so a lot of the deeper muscles that create stability for the joints are not always the muscles that they're used to accessing, because they use the more large, powerful muscles that are for dynamic movement and often leave other things behind. For instance, they did a study, the National Institute of Health in the United States did a study of female athletes, and these are people highly trained in their body and excelling at their sports, but they found a higher incidence of sacral problems, and they found there was either they tended to use their gluteal muscles late or not at all in certain actions.
And this is the firing process, the sequence in which they fire.
It's the firing order of muscles, and the gluteals were left out, and they substituted other muscles. And so you see some athletes, you see their quadriceps and hamstrings highly developed, but the gluteals not very much. And they had to be specifically taught how to get the gluteals to fire once again. And as they did that, that resolved a lot of the back and sacral problems that they had coming up before. In the process of doing sports.
I mean, gluteals is one of those things that yoga maybe gets sort of looked at and thought, well, yoga girls have got pretty flat butts, haven't they, compared to gym girls? Are we using our glutes much in the yoga?
It's been, there's body workers have been pointing out as they work with people in yoga with yoga injuries, they find yoga people tend to tuck the pelvis or tuck the tailbone a bit too much. And we're at the point where we're moving away from that instruction, but there's still that kind of habit of tucking the name of the bandhas, which is not really quite the bandhas. And so that deserves another look, because some of the sacral complaints and low back complaints are coming from these actions that are either done too simplistically or overdone. And so it's always a question of balance and feeling in your body what's working.
Do you feel, I mean, often the thing is, it's, as you say, a problem with weakness. And in many of the muscles, and quite often with the yoga there's sort of quite an emphasis on the lengthening or increasing range of motion, but it's not as easy to work on the strength, is it? We give it lip service and say strength is as important as flexibility, let's go stretch out, sort of thing.
Exactly. I mean, it's this idea of stretching when really, I was saying in the training, it's a paradox that we associate yoga with flexibility, because it was never really about flexibility. It was about stability, being stable for the breathing, being stable for meditation, even being stable in asana. And flexibility is a part of stability, but when the flexibility becomes promoted as the primary benefit, you sacrifice stability in the process, because if you overuse some muscles in the name of greater flexibility, you inhibit others, and it becomes imbalanced in the body. overall. And there's the problem that, like most endeavors in sports, there's a little bit too much pushing and not enough pulling.
Yeah.
So you're pushing in down dog, pushing in plank, pushing in, it's all the front body, and there aren't so many poses where you're using the back body in a way that balances out the muscles we used to push. And so you start to get problems of the shoulders being too far forward that affect the neck as well as the shoulders, as well as things down in the hips.
So what are the sorts of things that we can do in the yoga to bring more of an emphasis to the back of the body?
I kind of, first it off for me as a variation in how we use our arms, which is often simply a different positioning the arms in the same poses to feel different muscles working, and then from that move into the traditional posture from there. So it's finding different pathways to access or end up in the same posture for the sake of feeling other muscles activating and creating more of a sense of balance, which sometimes involves weird variations or different arm positions that they're not used to. For instance, instead of always having the arm out to the side like that, maybe to take it up a bit and see how the shoulder blade works differently.
Right.
And from there move into the traditional position. Because like they say, if you keep doing what you've always done, you'll get what you always got out of it. So if it's always simply the same alignment and the same action and poses, you just end up digging a rut for yourself.
But that you mentioned actually patterns in class earlier on. Of course, it's one of those things that crops up a lot. And one of the things is recognizing your own patterns. And do you feel that you can, the body left to its own devices, will sort out pattern, or do you feel that it needs definite intervention?
It needs some help with awareness. And I was again revisiting the whole question of the breath, and one Leanne Chaitau, who's actually based in the UK, was pointing out that our main movement pattern in the body is the breath, because that's what we do 21,000 times a day is breathe, take an inhalation, and it's also the most distorted movement pattern in the body, from postural habits, emotional habits. And so certainly as we breathe with movement, that helps to open the body, but if there's a distortion to the breath pattern, it doesn't necessarily fix itself.
Right.
For instance, in a case of scoliosis where the shape of the rib cage is distorted, if you tell this person simply to breathe deeply, it'll actually further distort the rib cage. So they have to intentionally work with the breath against the grain to expand the breath into the places that are contracted and firm in the places that are overstretched. And so often left to its own devices, the body will just increase that habitual pattern of movement until you become aware of how it's causing you problems and grow your way out of that pattern. Because the body is very much driven by habits, and we have bad habits as much as we have good habits. And we kind of, the body takes the path of least resistance. It does things the easiest way.
Whatever it's used to,
Yeah, and sometimes the easiest way is not the best way for the body, and so we have to find a way of growing out of that pattern. So the yoga especially gives us tools. It gives us not just a few exercises, but an integrated practice where we can take the same awareness in many different poses or many different venues and try to come to that new place with many different actions, whether it's a twist or a back bend or a forward bend. And it's just a relearning.
You were mentioning again something about twists in the class there, about this almost over twisting, using everything to take you in one direction, and sometimes the counter movement is quite nice. It makes it more valid almost.
Yeah, I mean the core is built to basically maintain the integrity of the body, and if we think of a twist as simply twisting the bones or twisting the spine with no resistance to that action, there are some parts of the spine, typically for people, and it's different for each person, that tend to move a little bit more than others. Yeah. Typically it's L4 and L5, which is where people get disc problems. Those vertebrae can twist or rotate a little bit further than the other vertebra, which is why the discs get ground down at that part of the spine. But there are other points in the middle of the back where when a person does a twist, they move a little bit too much in one part and not enough in the other part. So the abdominal or the core system creates enough resistance that the whole spine and body has to twist as a more integrated whole, and it can't go to those little release or cheat spots where it turns a little bit more. Yeah. because it's those places of instability that we start to get muscle spasms as the body's protective mechanism towards instability, and those muscle spasms become muscle pain.
And it's that core stability, isn't it, that gives us the protection for a lot of those areas.
Yeah.
But and so when people think of core, a lot of the time they think, okay, let's do some sit-ups, let's do some crunches.
Yeah.
You know, but it's not that, is it? It's something a little bit more
it's a little
finesse.
bit deeper and a little bit less exciting, because I was saying that the stabilizing aspect of the muscles are getting muscles to activate that don't necessarily move the body in dramatic ways. You do sit-ups, you're strengthening your abdominals, but primarily rectus abdominis, the obliques, you're not necessarily getting the transverse abdominals to work properly. And from that, from the flexion of the spine can become unstable or lose its curve, and then people get back problems from doing sit-ups. Whereas other approaches to the abdominals can work the core in a way that stabilizes the spine, so you can go into movements.
And what about the back? What do we need from the back? Because I remember in my gym days doing Roman chair sit-ups with a 20-kilo plate on my back, trying to get the extensors of the back like really strong and big. But that's not too clever either, is it?
Yeah, that's a little bit too strong, because we tend to prefer the larger, stronger muscles and leave behind the littler muscles. And I try to say, at least sometimes, yoga is about the little muscles, not the big ones.
Yeah.
If you really want to work the big ones, go into sports or bodybuilding, and there's an aspect of that strengthening in yoga too. But the original emphasis upon the bandhas was to work with the subtleties and the smaller muscles in the body that help to stabilize the body for movement, and we have to pay attention to those, which often means backing up, slowing down a little bit, and paying attention to not only how we hold things, but how we move into them, which again can make it a little bit less exciting to people who are looking for a good fitness workout. And again, if they want a fitness workout, they can certainly do it. And combining that with a yoga in which they're not quite so ambitious to do their dramatic stuff, but pay attention to the little things, that'll help to support their fitness practice and make a nice complement. But we often try to stuff everything into one practice. And so you try to turn your yoga practice into a hardcore workout at the same time, and then often one thing or another gets left out, and then that becomes problematic.
And so it's often the more sort of flamboyant movements or unusual movements that are more initially attracted to us, because they're not something we normally do, like the big back bends or being very deep in bound twists and things like that. But are there inherent risks in that sort of stuff?
Yeah, well, we're impressed by people who can do things that we can't do. If we could do that too, you'd shrug your shoulders and say, what's the big deal? Yeah. Which is where gymnasts get bored when they come into a yoga class. They're like, well, I can do that. What's the big deal? And they don't, there's something else that can be going on there. Yoga was made, the early teachers like Krishnamacharya and Iyengar, they were trying to popularize and promote yoga even in a culture where very few people even practiced yoga anymore. And so, in the sense of asana practice, and so they had to make it attractive to people and mainstream. And so they did the more flamboyant stuff to kind of attract people into it. And that became part of the attraction in the West as well. It wasn't purely a Western thing. Yeah. And then we start to associate yoga with those flamboyant actions, forgetting about the stuff that's really beneficial to us. Yeah. Therapeutically, I kind of point out to students, you get the greatest therapeutic benefit from the poses that you do up to maybe a level 2 or perhaps a level 3 class. And as you go into the more advanced classes, the therapeutic benefit, you start to get diminishing returns. You increase your flexibility, your range of motion, and ability to do things, but often at the sacrifice of stability. Yeah. And then years later, people start to complain about their yoga injuries. They came from a practice that kind of forgot the bread and butter aspect of it, where you're using the yoga to take care of yourself and not simply to impress yourself.
One of those areas is back bending, isn't it? And it's not something we need to do in everyday life, is it? Yeah. We don't reach over backwards, but yet it is taken to, I was going to use excess, but without trying to judge. Very deep back bends are being done nowadays. And do you feel that, we have the one side of thing where it's stimulating the nervous system and this, that, and the other, and the other side is like, You know, is the spine designed to be doing
Yeah,
that?
the question is, what is that really doing for you to go
Yeah.
that deeply? And somebody who can naturally do it, it feels good to them because it feels freeing. But
Yeah.
the body has a natural resistance to back bending. It's got ligaments set up to resist that, which is why we're not all in the Cirque du Soleil.
Yeah.
And in the process of stretching, we're maybe loosening up those ligaments a bit, which makes the spine less stable. And there's, again, you reach a point of diminishing returns with back bends where you can do a deeper and deeper back bend, but you have to ask yourself, what is this doing for me
Yeah.
therapeutically? And I could certainly list quite a number of benefits that come from doing the basic back bends without going too far.
So that would be Shalabhasana,
Yeah, things like-
Bhujangasana. And would you include maybe Ustrasana, Cobra posture,
that can,
camel posture? In that?
That's definitely beneficial, and it's also a little bit more challenging because
Yeah.
there's the risk of compressing the spine in the process. You can do it in a way that you lift out of that compression, but it's what I call the baby back bends, where you're taking the spine to a certain level of extension and the hips to a certain level of extension, but not, it's within the range that the stabilizing muscles of the spine, like the multifidi, are still active, protecting the spine and maintaining its curves. You go beyond that point in a back bend, the multifidi are no longer active and you're relying upon bigger muscles to do that. And that's where you get diminishing therapeutic returns because you start to reduce the stability of the spine.
Yeah.
I was just remembering reading in Mr. Iyengar's biography where he said his backbending, he started out very stiff in backbending and had to work very hard at getting that deep, but he did reach a point where his spine was still unstable from the backbending. He found he really couldn't do the pranayama anymore because his spine was too unstable to support the pranayama, so he had to back off a little bit and come back to his pranayama practice so the spine would support that. So there's that balance between how much does the back bending facilitate your breathing and how much does it start to get in the way of your breathing.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, there are even things that I had read about contortionists and circuses and even Cirque du Soleil, that extreme level of back bending, it actually shortens their lifespan.
Wow.
Because of the pressure put upon the internal organs. And they
Yeah.
certainly work very hard at keeping the spinal muscles strong and the abdominal strong to reduce that kind of pressure, but still you bend the spine to that degree.
Something's getting squashed, isn't it?
Yeah, it's all your abdominal organs and everything else is getting squashed,
Yeah.
and then you have to ask yourself, what exactly is that doing for me?
Yeah. It's entertaining though.
Yeah. Again, we're entertained by people that can do things that we can't. And
yeah.
so I kind of define an advanced yoga pose as when I can do something you can't, and when you reach the point where you can do it, I need to find a new advanced yoga pose to do. Otherwise you'll lose interest.
Yeah.
And I'm not interested in advanced poses overall.
Are there postures, like that seem inherently, or maybe fashionable, or whatever, that seem inherently just not worth the risk that you can think of? I know one springs to mind that got a lot of flack a few years ago was a Wild Thing, and there's another Rock Star, and these ones that are
these are poses that you can do safely, but you're
Yeah.
running a greater risk of not doing it safely just when you forget one part.
Yeah.
And so that's where I've become interested in understanding the body in terms of these fascial lines that Tom Myers has laid out and other people use, because it helps you to understand exactly what you're achieving for the body in terms of lengthening and strengthening and creating greater fluidity with stability. And if I think along those fascial lines, then I catch myself in the places in the body where I'm cheating.
Yeah.
For instance, in a back bend, if somebody hyperextends the neck too much in a back bend, it may take them further into the back bend, but now they're starting to compress the neck
Yeah.
and even give themselves a headache from doing it. And so, again, with the crazy poses, it's possible to do them safely, but it becomes more and more of a risk of people that it won't be done
Yeah.
safely. At which point you're asking yourself, why am I doing this or aspiring to this? And some people will say, because it feels good, in which case it's more power to you. We'll see how you're doing in the future. I'm not going to stop you. But to me, an advanced pose is a pose that really deeply benefits the body in terms of its functioning, your self-awareness, your breath, and your ability really to be with your body as part of your spiritual practice. I did find, in the early parts of yoga, with the first sense of meditation with the Upanishads, even going into Patanjali, there's an element of disassociating from the body as the cause of suffering. And so you go to meditation, which is someplace that's not here. And I think with the tantric systems and hatha yoga in particular, it was a process of re-inhabiting the body with the understanding you can go deeper in meditation when you're with the body than when you disassociate from it. It's a different quality and depth and meaningfulness to your spiritual practice. And so the physical practice became a practice of that re-inhabiting of the body.
Because on that same line, some people think, so they're sitting for meditation or something like that, that if they're feeling discomfort, they've got to
just bully themselves through it.
Yeah. And I always say, no, fuck's sake, just, I don't say that, of course. I say, perhaps you would like to move.
I mean, you have to move because something is contracting there. And there's, I think it's part of human personality, but it's been part of the history of yoga, is this relationship between, let's say, the spiritual side, where you're looking to come to a deeper experience through meditation, and the ascetic side, which is this, ascetics in general have this sort of inclination that the more you punish yourself, the more you advance. And so ascetic practices, including the early yogis, which were part of, it wasn't the same as the hatha yogis, but it wasn't entirely separate from it. I mean, for them, you hold a tree pose not for 30 seconds, but for 3 days. Because the more you punish the body, I mean, the early asanas among the ascetics were ways of punishing the body, not ways of benefiting the body, with the understanding that the further you go through that tapasya of self-punishment, the greater supernatural powers you achieve from that. And even today, when people say no pain, no gain, pain is just weakness leaving the body, it's that same human personality that I make greater progress when I punish myself. When you look at particularly the Hatha Yoga Pradipika and some of the early texts, it's actually warning the Hatha yogis not to overdo it. They said overexertion actually destroys your yoga. And they're speaking to the ascetics that maybe you're overdoing a little bit and you're not benefiting from the practice. So we're always pulling ourselves back from that sort of ascetic, hyper, go get 'em sort of physicalist, to say back off from that ascetic aspect and find the benefit of yoga by not punishing yourself quite so much.
It's quite a difficult game to play though, isn't it? Because we're used to, the physical practice of yoga is physical, and the way that we often judge ourselves is like if we're running where we go fast or we go further, if we're lifting weights we lift something heavier. Now we're in this room moving our bodies. How do we judge whether we're getting better or... It's quite difficult, isn't it?
I mean, any form of movement in exercise in any sense is going to involve a certain level of discomfort. I mean, it's easier just to sit and do nothing.
Well, that gets uncomfortable after a while.
I know. Sitting, that gets really uncomfortable and you feel like you have to move. But just getting up and doing something involves a certain level of discomfort. And then you realize that that's good, because going through that discomfort, you become stronger and more flexible and more at ease in your body. And like you're saying, the question is, how much discomfort is good, and when does it start to shift into discomfort for its own sake, or even pain as some kind of progress when it's really not progress at all? When does it shift into simply hurting ourselves in the name of progress? And that's again where the whole self-awareness comes in. It's like, how aware are we of our motivations in doing this? I mean, that's part of yoga too, which is to understand, why am I doing this? What am I seeking? What is the good for me? To ask yourself that question is a yoga also. And that gives you some guidance on how much is enough and how much is too much. And as a general guideline for people, I'm saying we're seeking greater range of motion with stability, and which can involve a feeling of discomfort or stretching in the middle of the muscle. If you start to feel sharp localized sensations of pain, particularly in the joints, that's usually not a good thing. And you need to back off. But if it's a more generalized discomfort that you're experiencing in the process, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So you can give people some guidelines for self-inquiry, but then it becomes, as you advance in your practice, it becomes a deeper inquiry for yourself of questions that nobody can really answer for you. But that's part of being an advanced practitioner, you're able to answer the questions for yourself.
And you mentioned just now Fascia and Tom Myers and the anatomy trains. I know in your book you you don't call them the anatomy trains, you call them fascial
Sutras. I call it's partly because Myers' work is a lot more detailed and elegant than what I can teach in a yoga class, because his work is designed for massage therapists that get in and get really specific about what they're doing to benefit the client. And that's a bit more than we can handle in a yoga class. So it's recognizing this is a simplified version of the same concept. And the word sutra, I'm trying to find language that a yoga practitioner can resonate with too. In other words, it sounds a little bit more yogic. And you have the sense that a sutra is a thread that binds things together. It's what makes connections between things. And it's also something to contemplate and learn from. And it's also, even as much as those are physical realities in the body, the different fascial lines that he identifies, that's also an abstraction, because the body is a whole fascial matrix. It's not simply certain longitudinal, even latitude lines. Those are abstractions out of that matrix that help us to understand it. But we really move and feel three-dimensionally. And the sutras are just, a guideline for feeling what the stretch is meant to accomplish. But we're coming to understand the fascia more and more. And I think the original language of the yogis was not empirically precise. When they talk about prana or a chakra, they're not talking about something you can physically find in the body or point to. It's experiential language that's pointing you often metaphorically towards a real experience that you can have if you focus on it in that way. So to speak of a flow of prana, on the one hand, sounds abstract and kind of woo-woo, or the sense of a flow of energy in the body. But I was showing how that feeling is a very real flow of sensation through the fascia. The fascia can get bound up or distorted in different ways that can create a block that actually creates pain in the body by the pressure put on the nerves. And if you undo that distortion in the fascia, there's a greater flow of circulation. There's less of a problem with the nerves in terms of tingling or numbness or the different things that come up in the body. All of that is a flow of prana, which includes circulation, nervous energy, and also just a different emotional quality to be in the body, a sense of being lighter or more at ease. All of this is language that the yogis were talking about in an experiential sense that we're starting to verify empirically as something that really happens in the fascia. How we hold memory in the fascia, how distortions are present in the fascia, and how it affects the functioning.
And the nerve endings as well.
Yeah, the nerve endings. We have more nerve endings in the fascia than any other tissue in the body. So when we talk about how we feel in the body, you're actually talking about how we feel in the fascia.
And can we actually, so it's this three-dimensional thing, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
We've been doing yoga for thousands of years, or 70 years, or whatever you want to think of it. Can we do anything different when we're practicing that allows us to target the fascia, or what can we do, or do we need to?
It never gets boring because you can always do something different.
Right.
I mean, you can always approach an asana from many different directions, each of which stimulates the body in a different way and gets the body to reintegrate in a different way, because it's all about integration and getting all of the parts to fit together. And it's such a wonderfully complex galaxy of parts that there's no one way to make all of the parts fit together. We'll end up overdoing or underdoing. So the asana is more, each asana is a tool for exploring the experience of integration rather than an end in itself or something we're trying to do.
Yeah.
As if when we achieve the asana, then we'll achieve the benefits. No, the process of experiencing the asana from different directions, that is the benefit, because that's a process of reintegrating. So there's always a different way of doing it. And like I said, that keeps it interesting. And I'll walk into class and say, let's do the asana this way. The students are like, that's the opposite of what you did last week. I'm like, that's the point. Now, how do you feel the asana when you do it from this direction?
Yeah.
And it turns into this argument about alignment where some teachers complain that we get too rigid about alignment, And there's a validity to that argument, because if we all do it in the same way, trying to fit ourselves into the same box all the time, it becomes rigid and even distorts our experience. And then at the other end of the spectrum, people want to often suggest throwing out the concept of alignment entirely and just let yourself move and feel, but then there are no pathways, or there's no definition of the pathways by which you have an experience. You just have an experience of flowing, which has its benefits of freedom, but it also takes away from what you might be experiencing in the practice if there was more, not so much boundaries in the asana, but pathways for experiencing flows of energy.
Because the chances are you'll move in the patterns that you already move in.
Yeah.
And so you're not really exploring, you're just moving as you normally move.
The habitual pattern. And you might explore something in one part of the body and forget that there's another part of the body that's doing the same thing it always did. And usually the signal for that is you start to experience pain or discomfort, and that's a little message from the body that's good for us, is like, maybe you shouldn't be doing it this way anymore. And then explore a new way.
So in some ways, then the alignment gives us a structure within which to explore and say, oh, okay, I can't do it like that. I wonder why I can't do it like that.
Yeah, it's a different form, and it's not a form not as a box, but a form as almost like a fairly well-defined energy matrix in which there's a lot happening. And each person experiences the pose differently, but that's because each person has a different body. But the more you feel an even flow of energy through the body with no dead spots where you're unaware or not feeling anything, then that's the best expression of that. I mean, Mr. Iyengar was even speaking about that when he was talking about how the skin moves in the body. He's talking about how the energy moves through the fascia and not simply the muscles. It's just something that's really hard to articulate or seems abstract for people sometimes. We have to find a different way to express it, perhaps.
And so if you're a vinyasa flow practitioner or a hatha practitioner, it is relatively easy to explore different ways of doing things and that sort of stuff. But if you're, so for myself, I'm an Ashtanga practitioner, we've got our sequences, and this is what you do, and you go into them this way and that way. So it's not quite as straightforward. So how could we play with this idea of experiencing the body in different ways and creating, I think you're getting at that sort of more variety is better for us, but we haven't got that opportunity. So what can we do?
Yeah, that's true, because I mean, somebody asked Moshe Feldenkrais what was the root of chronic pain, and his answer was interesting. He said it was a lack of variety of movement. Yeah. He didn't say a lack of movement, it's lack of variety. And because I practice with the Ashtanga flow too, and it's even an element of how I approach the practice. It's kind of the framework of the Ashtanga practice becomes kind of like the starting point that allows me to insert different postures or approaches.
Guest postures, I call them.
Guest postures, like that. And there is that rhythm between movement and pausing, and it's in that pause that allows you to explore, and also how you move to the next posture. It's looking sometimes for a different way of moving into it, or just experiencing a different aspect of that quality of movement that brings a greater sense of ease or stability. But often the transition perhaps is treated as, how do I get to the next posture? Sometimes, how do I get to the next posture in the most impressive way? Yeah. Whereas it could be the question of, how do I get to the next posture in the most stable way? Yeah. Or the way that supports the next posture. And it's kind of the flow of the vayus and sense of prana and apana, and samana becomes the moment of pause in between prana and apana, where you absorb the experience of being there. And samana vayu is the ability to be with the posture, to be in yourself without worrying about what comes next. It's that kind of pause in the flow. And our flow is a rhythm of movement and also a quality of just being able to be there. If a practice becomes too static, then you're just holding this posture and holding that posture. Yeah. And there's a certain level of the posture being there in the posture, but that can become a little bit too rigid, because the energy can get a little bit stuck from the sense of, I'm holding the posture, when it's really a quality of being in the posture instead of simply holding it. And that naturally interfaces with the flow. So yeah, there's room to put in guest postures
Yeah.
or a different variation for going into it. And the different series were developed as different kinds of flow where you can progress the different experiences. But even within a series, I mean, because the series tended to heap on more and more difficult postures to achieve,
Yeah.
where you can take the basic series and, I mean, even Urdhva Dhanurasana was not really an original part of the series, but it got, the first series, but it got
That's how I understand it.
incorporated by
Mm.
practitioners like Richard Freeman and the others because it seemed like a very natural and even necessary complement to everything that's going on. And so I think there's room for that. And we don't, my perspective is we don't have to get too wedded to a particular sequence because even the sequence becomes a lack of variety of movement.
And so for we can say that yoga lives within the sort of health and wellness sphere as a modality. A lot of people, it would be maybe their only physical activity. Do you think we can get everything we need for our body out of one thing like yoga?
Honestly, I don't.
No.
I mean, there are times when even working with weight training is necessary or other forms of exercise. Again, it creates balance, and so I certainly don't tell people they can get everything from yoga because it really doesn't quite work like that, especially at their level of practice. And it's meant to be complemented by other forms of exercise, especially stuff that you're drawn to. Often people get bored or disenchanted with their yoga practice because they think that's the only thing that I'm doing, and then after a while they feel like they need something else, and then they get disenchanted with yoga because now I'm doing this thing. And the question is, how does that thing enrich your yoga practice and make it interesting again? And how does your yoga practice make that form of exercise more interesting to you? So it becomes a galaxy of how you take care of yourself. And the center of the yoga practice is not what you do in terms of these are the poses I practice. It's what awareness am I cultivating within this form of practice that can also spill over into other kinds of movement.
And so we're sort of both, without sort of labeling you, anatomy geeky types. So we're naturally drawn to inquiry about how the body works and stuff like that. And a lot of people get frightened off by the language or by this, that, and the other. And something I noticed in the class was that you weren't making the language a big thing. You because it can become a barrier to learning. And so my question to you is, so people that feel they need to know a bit more, or want to know a bit more, how can they go about it without getting sort of opening sort of these huge volumes that sort of...
I kind of call it under the hood thinking. It's like you have a car, it runs fine. When it stops working, you take it to the mechanic. And often you're like, don't explain the engine to me, just
just fix it.
But if you want to fix the car for yourself, you have to start to understand what the parts are. And so there's a certain amount of technical understanding that helps you to go deeper into it. But that's not necessarily what you share with students in the class, because the real emphasis is in the class on what they're feeling and what they're experiencing and how that's good. And if they have questions, why does that work for me? Or I'm having this pain, why am I having that pain? That's where you sprinkle in a little bit more knowledge, at least as far as what they're doing, as far as misaligning, like locking the knees, for instance, or something simple like that. And you can point out that the pain you're experiencing perhaps is in this muscle, and so it will work differently. So you can gradually introduce a little bit of self-appreciation on a technical level without going overboard. And it was useful for me to learn the anatomy through the lens of the yoga, because it allowed me to focus on what's most important to know. Because you don't need to know all 600 muscles in the body. You need to know the ones that are really important, both for overcoming pain syndromes and also doing your practice effectively, and to see how they link together. And so yoga becomes a good lens for understanding anatomy without becoming overwhelmed by it. And we're trying to turn it into more experiential language. Again, the language that Thomas Myers uses in describing the anatomy trains is much more technical in the sense of being far more precise and clear, that can be communicated to another body worker, whereas that level of technical clarity is not necessarily useful to a yoga teacher or yoga practitioner, but they can get the same benefit of understanding without getting quite so caught up in the language.
And there's certain things, because I know that you hopefully continue to learn as you go through
Yeah.
your life.
Yeah.
And there's certain things that I've thought, my God, did I say that X number of years ago?
Yeah.
And there's certain things that stand out in your mind as to, okay, I had this view then, and now with the things I know, I've changed my mind.
Yeah, you can be a little bit of self-forgiving because, people hear something new when you've learned something and they come up and they're like, my God, was I doing it wrong all of those years? And I would say it's not a question of being wrong, it's just we weren't quite right enough.
Yeah.
And you can always be a little bit more right without being wrong.
Yeah.
And so actions of the shoulders, like drawing the shoulders back, or the idea of, drawing the shoulder blades together, or firming the tips of the shoulder blades into the back, that language initially kind of served people, and then it started to get overdone. And so now we can look at how we move the shoulder blades in a more balanced way that doesn't create quite so much stress. And so it often becomes a slightly different description of how you feel the shoulder blade moving on the back, sometimes coming into it from a different position that achieves the same effect without overdoing. I think the problem with previous instructions was, in the name of being simple, the language got a little bit overdone or oversimplified, and people took that as an instruction that they stick to, like pressing the tips of the shoulder blades into the back. The effect is, as you press the tips of the shoulder blades in, that's not necessarily wrong as far as activating the muscles, but the result is people started to tilt the rib cage and started to jam their back by overdoing that. Or in the name of doing that action, they were actually doing something different. So it's always refining the language so that the person does the action in a more balanced way. And sometimes you have to start out simply and then add levels of refinement where they start to feel it in a more subtle way.
And one of the things you mentioned today, like also with the keys for alignment and things, we were looking at Warrior One, weren't we? And you were saying, okay, let's start with our legs apart maybe rather than together, because not all our pelvises are small and narrow, So sort of things like that. And it comes from teachers. A lot of the time they might say, okay, do it like this because it seems to be works for their body, but then actually it doesn't work for anybody else, or not many.
Exactly, and we do need to recognize how people's bodies function differently, and so and often a teacher is advanced to a point where what feels good for him doesn't feel so great for the students because he's in a different place, and actually what he's doing might be causing pain that the students don't experience, and so he'll do things to get out of pain. For instance, the idea of rolling up out of Uttanasana. Somebody with a very extended lumbar spine, to roll up out of Uttanasana releases the muscles for that person. They say that feels really good. But the majority of people in class, often the lower back muscles are too weak and they're not extended in that way. So if they try to roll up out of Uttanasana, it's actually further weakening and stressing their back in a way that teacher doesn't, and so it doesn't serve the student. And so the teacher has to take into account where they're at and how their body functions and how they've gotten to a point of functioning in that way.
And so if you could, because I know they're going to be coming in here, so we've nicked a therapy room at the Life Centre here. To sort of wrap it up, first of all, thank you so much for spending your time and giving us some great information. But to leave you to say the last word, if somebody, they're practicing their yoga, and they want to take it to a more inquiring state, how could they start? What could they start thinking about while they're practicing?
It's less about putting your body in a certain form. That's what we learned in the beginning. Triangle pose looks like this, warrior looks like that. That's where we start. It's more awareness of how the parts fit together. How does what you're doing in your legs fit to what you're doing in the torso and the arms? And if you're experiencing a discomfort in a certain part of the body, it's not just how is that part of the body misaligned, how is that relating to the other stuff going on? Is locking your knees causing a problem in your back or your shoulders? And so unlock, and I'm always telling people to unlock their joints, because we tend to lock the joints because that's the easy thing to do. And when you unlock the joints, then you start to feel connection in the sense of a flow of energy through the muscles, of how the muscles work together to support each other. So there's more of a feeling of space in the joint, less of a feeling of compression in the joint or a feeling of a discomfort or kind of blockage in different parts of the body. So we're really looking at how do we experience how all the parts fit together so you feel the pose in every part of the body at once. And I think that's a key to what makes yoga meditative, because the meditative quality of yoga is not just becoming still in the posture, though that's an element of it. If you expand your awareness to every part of the body at once, the mind really has nothing to hold on to, and so the mind doesn't become busy because you've dissolved it into this more expanded awareness. That's an experience of meditation in the asana also, where the mind, technically they call that laya, or an expansion of consciousness. You've spread the mind into such an expanded experience of consciousness, you experience stillness in that movement or in that being. That's a kind of meditation that you can take into your meditation practice too. So it's the advanced practice is experiencing most fully where you are without worrying about what comes next. You certainly move to what comes next, but if we're always thinking about what comes next, we're not present here.
What we're doing now.
How do I get to the next posture?
Yeah.
And that's just the natural human tendency, because we're always projecting into the future. And even the physiotherapists point out it's that very problem of projecting into future that limits our breath as well as our body. I mean, some people, their head enters the room before the rest of the body because the head is projecting forward, and also the patterns by which we breathe get limited by what we're anticipating in the future. And we can't get out of anticipating the future, but we can draw ourselves more into being in the present, and that allows us to project into the future without getting ruled by the future.
Brilliant.
In a sense. It's a little bit of both.
Cool. And if people want to catch up with you as you're traveling around, where do they need to go to find out information?
My website has a schedule on it where you can kind of see where I'm going, because I travel.
And that's Do More Yoga, is it called?
It's just doyoga.
doyoga.com.
I'm sure somebody's going to pick up Do More Yoga.
Yeah, exactly.
But I got my domain first. And if you go to my website and sign up for the mailing list, that tells me where you're from. So when I send out an emailing about workshops, I tend to target it in the places that I'm going to. So you won't constantly get emails.
Okay, so you're not going to send me to Auckland or something like that.
Exactly. So when I'm coming to Germany, I'll send an email to people in the vicinity of Germany that are reasonably easy to travel to.
Cool.
So that gives you some notification that way too.
Brilliant. Thanks so much again, Doug, for your time. And it's been such a nice experience sitting in and listening to you do your thing as well.
I appreciate it.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks.